what the UN's mandating. Their answer to that question is, we're not into a two-state solution. We want to create a greater Palestine. We want our land back. We want, what is Israel? Sure, Jews can live there. We're not against that. And Jews always have lived there, so that's fine by us. But no, we don't want two separate countries. So it's a bit the same with the Cypriots. The Turkish Cypriots say, honestly, you ask us what we want after the history we've been through, we want a completely separate country. We want a little independent microstate, the Turkish Republic of North Cyprus, as they like to call it, TRMC. That's what we want, that's our preferred solution. And the Greek Cypriots say, excuse me, we're 80% of the population here. That we're happy that Turkish Cypriots are part of our country, but they are a minority, a respected minority, of course, but we believe in human rights and democracy, and thank you very much, the Turkish army can get out of our country, we can reunite our country, and we'll guarantee the rights of our minority here, the Turkish Cypriots. And what's wrong with that? What's the argument against that? Why is the world sort of against that? We don't want some power-sharing arrangement by zonal bi-communal federation where the two communities, as they did in the 1960 constitution, share power between them. We don't want that. And separate zones and things, we don't want that. So I really want to dwell on this because you have a situation where the international community, intellectuals, politicians, diplomats, and some Cypriot leaders say, look, we understand what you're saying, we understand how you feel, but mate, it's never going to happen. It's never going to happen. I would say that in the Middle East, it's definitely clear, it's never going to happen. A greater Palestine is not going to be recreated. It's the preferred view of the Palestinians, but it's just not going to happen. The Israelis aren't going to allow that to happen, and nor are the Americans. Simply not going to happen. The Turkish army, a huge army, the second biggest army in NATO, the Turkish army is not going to say, oh, okay, well, we took over we took over 37% of this island. We created a safe zone for the Turkish Cypriots, but you said to us, well, Greek Cypriots majority, we should just get out. And the Turkish Cypriots will be looked after as a respected minority, but the Greek Cypriots will run the place as a Hellenic island, and gee, all that war stuff was just a huge mistake, so we're off. I mean, I'll tell you what, not only would that be hugely unpopular with the Turkish Cypriots, who would take up arms if you tried to impose that upon them, but it would create a constitutional crisis in Turkey. There is no way the Turkish army and there's no way the Turkish public would ever support a solution like that. Now, there are 800 or so thousand, 750 or so thousand Greek Cypriots, and there are 80 million Turks. So just do the maths there. Turkey is 60 kilometres away from Cyprus. This is not a solution that is ever going to happen. It's just not going to happen. So we would think, as we would regard ourselves as Australians, as reasonable and balanced and thoughtful people, we would think, well, what, and it's a very Anglo-Saxon sort of way of thinking, well, what works is what's okay. If it works, it must be good. Well, they're not thinking about it like that. They're thinking about it in lots of other ways, in terms of their history, in terms of their demographics and their cultures and so on. These things are hugely important to them, not just would it work or wouldn't it work. That's a good question, would it work? So I have been spending the last 5.5 years sitting down with these two sides, with the leaders of these two sides, and working with our office in New York, trying to, and with a couple of academics from this university, trying to work out how we can create a solution which is reasonably saleable to the publics of Cyprus. There's a lot more to say here about what has happened and what hasn't happened. But we've been encouraging them to agree to some sort of a power-sharing model We've been encouraging them to solve some of the other technical problems that there are in a reasonable way. And here is the point I want to make. They have agreed during that period on a huge amount of this. We have 77 pages, as we say, of convergences between the two sides. We have an agreed joint declaration on what the shape of this agreement should look like, and the basic terms of the agreement will be. But no, I finished up on the Thursday before Easter in that job, and we still haven't concluded a final agreement here, because the politics of it are so difficult. So you can sit down with the President of Cyprus, the Greek Cypriot leader, President Nikos Anastasiadis, and he will agree with a lot of what I'm saying here. He's not going to really disagree with anything I've said here tonight. He wouldn't put it the way I put it, of course. He would have his own spin for his audience, but to you here, he might put it a little bit the way I do, I suppose. He wouldn't disagree with that. But his problem is that the public are not really very sympathetic with this idea of power sharing with the Turkish Cypriots. Now, I've always said to the Secretary-General, Ban Ki-moon, I say to him, Secretary-General, we can't want this agreement as outsiders more than they do. And let me leave that thought with you when you think about conflict societies and the need for reconciliation. Of course, if you're one of the people who is, you know, doing the reconciles, you have to reconcile with someone, you're a Greek Cypriot and you have to do it, or you're a non-Indigenous Australian and you have to reconcile with Indigenous Australians, that's something you yourself have to do, that's one thing. But it's another thing if you're an outsider and you're saying to people, look, haven't we got a great idea for you? Wouldn't this work really well? At the end of the day, it's not going to work at all, no matter how articulate and persuasive and charismatic you are, and I might have been none of those things, or even if I was, it's not going to make the slightest difference if they don't like the bill of goods that I'm trying to sell to them. I said that the positive of this was that they haven't gone back to war with each other since 1974. There are no acts of terror occurring in Cyprus. So to some extent, they're prepared to live with a status quo which is a divided island, 37% of it in the north, the Turkish Cypriot part, the rest the Greek Cypriot part, the Republic of Cyprus. They don't like it. Two sides don't like it. Neither side likes it. But you know they're prepared. I say they're prepared to live with it. They would rather live like that than kill each other. And so I suppose that brings me to two conclusions here from my experience in Cyprus, which you know is it's a bit of a niche issue, the Cyprus issue, but it brings me to two or three conclusions about this whole issue of particularly peace and reconciliation. Truth, I think I've made my point to you about truth. Well, that just depends where you come from. What is the truth? It seems to me that what the international community should do with conflict societies is not actually, and this sounds, somebody who was a foreign minister for a long time, sounds a bit weak, but not be too ambitious, not be too dictatorial, not be too culturally, historically and politically insensitive to think, well, you know, this isn't any good, this is what you should do, and any person with a triple figure IQ can see that's what you have to do, and since half the population has got a triple figure IQ by definition, then this is going to happen, surely. That is not a good attitude. And tutting people for their behaviour, I mean, you can tut them for grotesque human rights abuses, and that's absolutely fine, and so you should do a bit more than tut them, you should be really doing things about it. But tutting people because they're not reconciling with each other, it ain't any good. You can do it, it might make you feel good, you go back home to your partner and how was your day, dear? It was just brilliant. I said that the Turkish Cypriots and the Greek Cypriots should reconcile. And what did they say, dear? They didn't say anything. Of course they didn't say anything. They didn't even hear you. That's what she would, or he would say when you came home, if they knew anything about these issues. So the secret is so not to be so ambitious that you start creating solutions for all of these societies from the outside without being aware of the politics on the inside. Less ambitious is to try to create a degree of stability. And if you are going to intervene, by the way, and a lot of you will use some examples here, some of them you will use at my expense, by the way, but if you are going to intervene, the best advice I could give you, intervene however you intervene, usually diplomatically, of course, or you want sanctions or even military intervention in extreme cases. If you're going to intervene, my advice is make sure with your brilliant plans for intervention, you're not going to make the situation actually worse. When I left to go to New York to go to Cyprus, and I saw the Secretary General in July 2008, and he said, you know, well, good luck, and I hope you enjoy it, and so on. And I said, well, you know, the first basic challenge for me, Secretary General, is to go to Cyprus, to do what I can there, but to make sure I don't make the situation worse than it currently is. And I think you might agree with me that there are many cases where there has been highfalutin diplomacy and speeches and sanctions and active engagement, which has made the situation much worse. I think Syria is a very good case in point. I can't believe how bad the situation is there, and I am hugely critical, privately, hugely critical of many actors there. Yes, President Assad is a bad guy, but you don't want to do things which will make the situation in Syria even worse. 150,000 people have been killed, now it's been made much worse than it was before. I went to Damascus about 4 years ago, walking through the streets of Damascus, people in the markets and so on. The market itself has been blown up. The situation has been made a lot worse. In Cyprus, I didn't want to make the situation worse, and yay, I got out of there and I didn't make the situation worse. I regard this as a huge achievement. You wouldn't even think about it. Modest achievement, you might say, at best. And that's true, modest achievement. Lots of activism, lots of ideas, lots of arguments with the two sides, but no one got killed, and the situation is slightly better now. And it's quite a lot better now than when I turned up there. Understand the politics, understand the history, show a degree of respect for the different versions of the truth. Don't try and force your version of the truth on people because they will reject you. Try to get them to understand what is possible and what is not possible. That's an interesting challenge. Try to get them to understand what is not possible. I sometimes think about this. I was in Beirut a couple of years ago, and I was talking to the head of UNHCR, in the United Nations High Commission for Refugees in Beirut, and I had visited one of the Palestinian refugee camps in southern Lebanon earlier that day. So I was talking to him about this. To be honest with you, I was expressing not a small amount of concern. What I said is refugees go back to 1948. He said to me, 80% of the people in that refugee camp, near Sidon, 80% of the people in that refugee camp believe that they are going, so-called, to return to Israel. Well, and they think it will happen in the next 3 or 4 years. I mean, this is just rubbish. It's not ever going to happen. It's not practical. It's not realistic. It's not going to happen. It is important to be realistic with people about what can be done and can't be done. So in that sense, there is an educative function. If there is a status quo, as there is in Cyprus, there's a status quo in Kashmir. There's a status quo actually in the Middle East as well. In all three of those cases, some people are getting killed between the Israelis and Palestinians, but I have to say to you, if you want killing in the Middle East, that's not where it is. It's in Syria, Yemen, places like that. Not between the Israelis and the Palestinians. I would say to John Kerry, don't intervene in ways that are going to make the situation worse, which might increase the chances of that happening. And I leave that very ambitious thought with you. So when you talk about, let's go back to where I started, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have, and I can answer them about, I can't necessarily answer them, but you can ask me questions about anything you want. Let me go back to where I began. It is banal, it's trite to say there should be reconciliation here. Go to Damascus, catch a plane to Damascus, and stand there in the ruins of that beautiful old market. It's a gorgeous place, Damascus. If you've been there, you'll know. It's a gorgeous place, or it was. For me, a huge tragedy what's happened in Syria. And say, gee, this is terrible. You people need to reconcile. That's pathetic. That's not what's going to happen. That shows a complete lack of understanding of what has happened in Syria and how what has happened has happened. It's happened. I mean, there were the seeds of this. If you understood how Syria worked, the seeds of this were always there. And then people have intervened, and they made the situation a catastrophe. Don't go to Jerusalem and just read the Riot Act to people and tell them they need to reconcile and, gee, all of this is a bit sad, because that's probably not showing much understanding, and neither side's going to be very impressed with you saying that. So understand the issues, understand what the people think, understand for the rational politician. Did you know there was such a person as a rational politician? For the rational politician who has made an assessment of what is doable and what is not doable, have some sympathy for that character, because that character is showing real leadership, because she or he is going to go out there and try and persuade a reluctant public to swallow something which isn't all that great. So I hope that gives you, I think that's probably not very optimistic, but it should be, because I think the first challenge of diplomacy when you're dealing with conflict societies is to remember what I said 2 or 3 times through this lecture, and that is, for goodness sake, don't make the situation worse. Don't do that. Thank you very much.